The Making of a Luna. Previous episodes are available on the playlist. You can also visit our website for your favorite stories. A link is provided in the video description. Episode 13. A thorough investigation revealed that the hunters who entered the forest on that particular day were not affiliated with the organization. The conduct of the aforementioned parties was nothing short of preposterous, evoking the image of renegades within their own ranks. It is a matter of some perplexity that rogue hunters would engage in the capture of ordinary pack werewolves. In accordance with established protocol, the hunting of non-compliant lawbreakers is exclusively designated for the association-approved hunters. The witches that had been brought with them were not affiliated with any covens. Esm, the leader of the witches, failed to recognize the amulet they retrieved from the forest when the king inquired about it the last time she was present. Following the presentation of the ring to Elara, the subject was observed to undergo a significant change. Secondly, following the incursion by hunters, rogues also entered their borders. The presence of rogues in possession of hunters' weapons is a matter of particular concern. It is noteworthy that on the two occasions when their future queen was injured, and on the second occasion when their king was injured, the subjects displayed a remarkable level of concern. In this case, the king's actions can be considered partially at fault, as his decision to move forward was influenced by his unrequited love, which resulted in an unintended consequence. An analysis of the potential commonalities between witches, rogue werewolves, and hunters is warranted. The rationale behind the alleged collusion against them remains unclear. At this point, it is reasonable to conclude that the only elements that would be absent from this hypothetical set are vampires and dragons. The phenomenon can be likened to the act of amassing a multitude of stray animals. In addition to the imperative for a thorough investigation of the attacks, he and the council were tasked with ascertaining grounds for the dismissal of the alphas and betas who had congregated at the palace and were awaiting Theron's meeting with them on the second day following the ball. Upon being informed that the meeting would be rescheduled, some individuals readily acquiesced, while those affiliated with more prominent organizations demonstrated a higher degree of skepticism. It was not feasible for them to simply state that His Highness was unconscious and therefore unable to preside over the meeting. At that time, a significant number of humans had also gone missing. Typically, this would not fall under their purview, however, based on the available evidence, it appears that rogue elements may be involved. The subject's actions were characterized by a disregard for the possibility of being discovered by humans, despite the conspicuous nature of their actions. It was evident that the situation could not deteriorate further. This was the conclusion that was reached as he was entering the grounds of the academy. He had just returned from checking on the missing humans with his assistant when he was proven wrong. The situation could potentially deteriorate further. From the vantage point of the academy, the most abominable auditory phenomena were perceived emanating from a considerable distance. These sounds were characterized by a profound sense of terror and a violent, disruptive quality. The auditory experience was characterized by a complex array of emotions, including rage, sorrow, anger, regret, and loss. These emotions were intricately interwoven into a single, poignant howl, evoking a visceral response of fear and empathy in the listener. Upon hearing this sound, the assistant, who was already on the ground, experienced a strong reaction, nearly losing their balance due to the intense fright. Elias maintained his upright posture, yet even he exhibited a gesture of submission, with hair on the back of his neck standing in fear. A sudden and unanticipated event transpired throughout the academy, causing a state of collective panic among the student body, faculty, and security personnel. The incident resulted in a rapid and simultaneous collapse of individuals across the premises, with many losing consciousness and experiencing respiratory distress. Teachers with a higher rank were either standing or kneeling with their necks exposed, while all of the students were kneeling, and a significant number of them had also collapsed on the floor. The utterance indicates an acknowledgement of the present moment and its implications. The assistant's speech was characterized by a noticeable stuttering, suggesting a struggle to inhale, and he would be able to identify the howl's distinctive characteristics even in a noisy environment. The howl emanating from the werewolf king was unlike any auditory experience the man had previously encountered. His Highness. Elias expressed trepidation regarding the implications of this phenomenon. Even during the war decades ago, Theron had never exhibited such behavior, had never demonstrated such savagery and domination, and had never demanded such submission from them. It appeared as though he had been driven by an unrelenting desire to exact retribution upon each and every werewolf present within the confines of the academy. It is imperative to ascertain the rationale behind the highest-ranking werewolf's peculiar behavior, particularly in this specific context. A meticulous examination of the available evidence suggests that there is a single, overarching factor that could account for this behavior. Elara. Elias articulated in a hushed manner, endeavoring to liberate himself from the psychological constraints imposed by Theron. In the process, he underwent a partial transformation. The subject's fangs and claws extended, and his green eyes turned black, before he ran towards the sound. The following is a list of key elements that must be included in any discussion of this subject. As the group traversed the thoroughfare between the training facilities and the study facilities, several educators, the constituents of Elara's pack, and a contingent of guards were positioned in a kneeling posture at a slightly greater distance from the monarch. They were visibly agitated, their bodies quivering with fear. The latter individual had also collapsed, his knees resting on the snow-covered ground in front of a small patch of blood. "I will kill you all. All of you will perish today." His voice reverberated as his alarming howl came to an end. The words, imbued with a profound sense of lethal intent, further exacerbated their trepidation. They descended until their heads reached the ground, yet none present could discern what actions had provoked His Highness's ire. His Highness arrived in his wolf form, hastily traversing the barriers in his path, opting for a more direct approach over the conventional route, and ultimately arriving at the designated location, where he abruptly knelt on the frozen ground, a gesture that defies rational explanation. Upon observing the subject in such a state of distress, they hastily arrived at the conclusion that an untoward event had undoubtedly transpired. Consequently, they were motivated to extend their assistance. However, at this juncture, the king had not yet inquired of them, nor had he exhibited any overt signs of intent to do so, despite having previously issued threats of lethal violence. Nonetheless, his words did not appear to be a threat, rather, they appeared to be an impending reality. The incident also affected the Moonlight students, who were erroneously included in the situation. The students had just completed a thorough exploration of the Academy's entire territory, as instructed by their instructor. They were now preparing to convene with Elara and resume their academic obligations. However, Theron's howling had also brought them to a halt, causing them to fall prostrate as they experienced a sense of suffocation. Amidst the frigid environment, Theron's actions signaled a transition beyond the threshold of return. His grasp encompassed the diminutive crimson flakes of snow, which, under his touch, commenced a process of thawing. These flakes, once pristine and immaculate, descended in a series of diminutive rivulets, ultimately finding their final resting place on the icy terrain below. As the blood-soaked snow melted completely, he thrust his hands into the ground in a state of rage, his bones already undergoing a massive transformation, reshaping into enormous paws. The subject's jaws were observed to be in a closed position, and a series of audible cracking sounds were produced. These sounds were followed by the subject's body changing shape, becoming elongated and ending in a snout that was black, furry, and equipped with sharp teeth and canines. Concurrently, the subject's spine underwent a transformation, resulting in a posture that was now quadrupedal. This posture was accompanied by the extension of the subject's tail, which was observed to be of considerable length. The subject underwent a transformation into his midnight black wolf form. Dusk was overwhelmed with grief, and this emotion could no longer be repressed, a sentiment that Theron did not intend to perpetuate. He also expressed a desire to kill all those who had failed to protect his beloved. It is evident that the subject in question expressed a negative response, which can be most aptly conveyed by the phrase "oh, no." Elias articulated in a hushed, breathless manner in the presence of the substantial wolf. The colossal black creature ascended from the ground, its deep, rumbling growl resonating continuously from its larynx. Initially, his movement was characterized by a deliberate and measured pace. However, this did not mitigate the gravity of his presence and the implications of his actions. The creature's mouth, which was of considerable size, opened wide, revealing its prominent canines and minute droplets of saliva, reminiscent of those produced by a raging beast. His head was lowered, and his ears were standing up in an intimidating manner, as his tail swung slowly with each step. He was on the verge of approaching the teachers and physically assaulting them, each step he took sending minor vibrations through their feet, causing them to quake in fear and acknowledge their impending demise. In such a state, Theron was incurable. No one would be capable of impeding him in this condition. He was more powerful than the Council of 12 combined. In such a situation, the king would only react to his mate, his queen, the only anchor to his savageness. However, they did not have such an individual, and thus, there was no way out. He did not even request an explanation for the crime they could have committed. Elias, our queen, has gone missing. His Highness is hastening to the Academy. Oren expeditiously transmitted the relevant information via the designated communications channel as he neared the Academy. He was in close proximity to His Highness when the telephone call was abruptly terminated, and the latter abruptly exited the scene. Regrettably, the hyperlink functioned exclusively when the two subjects were positioned at a specific proximity to one another. This circumstance enabled Oren to apprise Elias of the unfolding events only at a subsequent point in time. Had he done so earlier, Oren would have promptly notified the security personnel on the premises, who might have intervened to address the situation. However, it appeared that the telephones had also been subject to interference. He was unable to establish communication with any members of the guard. Theron. Dusk. Elias, now cognizant of the events that had transpired, vociferously approached the teachers. "Cease immediately!" He informed Theron of the situation, yet she continued her forward movement toward them. He no longer recognized any of them as friends or allies, he merely regarded them as prey that needed to be dealt with. The individuals present expressed admiration for Elias's intervention, recognizing his courage in challenging the authority of the king, a feat they themselves lacked. However, they acknowledged the futility of such actions. The king's behavior indicated an inability to be reasoned with. "Elara!" Elias vociferated abruptly just as the beast initiated the act of biting him, which would have resulted in his demise. The students present at Moonlight experienced a state of paralysis at the mere utterance of her name. The question arises as to why Elias would initiate this topic in the presence of Theron. The teachers, however, failed to comprehend the reasoning behind this decision. However, the one that completely halted in his current state of madness was one that Dusk comprehended with absolute clarity. He gradually closed his mouth, yet his growling did not cease, as Elias proceeded. "If you expend your time and energy addressing our concerns, you are effectively squandering a valuable opportunity to focus on the critical task of saving her. Such actions, we contend, are not conducive to the well-being of the Queen and, as such, are to be avoided." Elias articulated audibly, seeking to ensure the creature's comprehension, as the audience responded with audible gasps at the mention of the word Queen, despite their current state of trepidation. It was only at this juncture that the wolf's fury abated entirely, enabling the human aspect to predominate. The savage beast underwent a transformation, becoming Theron, who collapsed once again on the ground, tears streaming down his face. This marked a stark contrast to his earlier state of madness. "They took her from me, Elias. Despite the fact that I am unable to detect her scent in the atmosphere, I am incapable of locating her. My friend," he articulated with a raspy quality as Elias removed his coat and affixed it to Theron's exposed back. "Theron, you are excessively involved and your thinking is not clear. It is imperative to take a step back and acknowledge that the individual in question is the sole person capable of locating her. Accompany me, as there is a course of action that may be taken." Elias informed his companion of the fact that he had been a step away from death, but he did not consider the possibility that he had been close to being killed. Above all else, he had always been a friend to Theron. Following the issuance of a directive to the assembled individuals to refrain from discussing the incident, Elias promptly directed the guards to commence a thorough search for the missing persons within the Academy's jurisdiction. The occurrence of this kidnapping could not have been realized without the complicity of an internal party. However, the identification of a suspect was swift, as the Moonlight students, having discerned an anomalous element in his discourse, promptly informed Elias of their missing teacher. In a departure from his usual approach, the combat instructor, Ben Brooke, informed the students that he would be absent for a brief period, following which he would return to provide further instruction. Typically, the students would have exercised on the training grounds, however, on this occasion, they did not question their teacher's motivations, presuming that the objective was to extend the distance of their jog. The issue at hand was that, despite the significant elapsed time since he had instructed them to do so, the teacher had not yet returned. "We would like to offer our assistance as well. Elara is our alpha. Regardless of the circumstances, we are also capable of conducting a search for her." Jackson articulated his concerns, indicating a perceived threat to her physical safety. "In the event that action is required, we will provide notification." Elias stated that further elaboration was not provided, and that the urgency of the situation necessitated immediate action. Consequently, both Elias and Theron promptly departed, leaving Oren behind to meticulously search for additional evidence. The royal palace is the site of the following events. Ascending expeditiously up the steps of the stairway leading to the throne room within the royal palace, Theron and Elias were greeted by 5 of his council members. Varek, Seth Albert, Merrick Johnson, and 3 others had swiftly arrived at Theron's summons. The remaining individuals were preoccupied with pack-related matters in disparate regions of the world and were unable to attend due to the impromptu nature of the request. Notwithstanding, the aforementioned parties had, in fact, proceeded to dispatch the individuals as per the directives issued by His Highness. In the expansive throne room, Theron took his seat on the throne. The assembly comprised his relatives, council members, and other close werewolves who had been aware of his departure on the night of the attack in the forest. They bowed and awaited His Highness's customary authorization to stand. Typically, the king would request that they raise their heads without delay, however, on this occasion, he did not. Consequently, they found themselves in a state of social discomfort, their heads bowed in a gesture of deference. The atmosphere was characterized by a pervasive sense of unease and confinement. The rationale behind the assembly remained ambiguous, despite the persistent inquiries from the spouses, children, and grandchildren present. All individuals over the age of 16 had been directed by the council members to proceed to the royal palace without any prior information. With a keen gaze, Theron surveyed his surroundings, anticipating the presence of the informant, while concurrently harboring a fervent desire to confront them directly should they be within range. In this state of heightened awareness, Theron deliberately emitted his alpha aura, a deliberate act that was meticulously timed and intended to send a clear message to any potential threats in his vicinity. An aura, reminiscent of the one at the academy, enveloped them, causing them to succumb to the ground, with the more formidable individuals managing to kneel only with great effort. "Council members, I believe I have waited long enough. The individual in question is of the utmost importance," Theron informed the 5 elders who stood on his right side in the front with a sharp, harsh tone. This revelation left all those present, including the Academy's faculty members, perplexed, although this sentiment was not overtly expressed. The councilmen refrained from verbal replies to the king, instead opting to express their allegiance through physical gestures such as bowing their heads. It is evident that His Highness had demonstrated a sufficient level of respect. It is reasonable to assume that he would have preferred to ascertain the identity of the informant through a more rudimentary method. However, recognizing that he was not an authoritarian figure, Theron had not employed this method to identify the informant. He had demonstrated benevolence toward their families, extending respect for the years he had spent in their company. To what end did it lead him? The Queen's absence was now a conspicuous absence. The man had initially intended to confine her within the confines of his palace, awaiting the manifestation of her powers. However, he ultimately relented before the insistent gaze and voice of the diminutive woman, consenting to her attendance at the academy. It is evident that he exhibited a certain degree of negligence, as he was unaware of the individual's identity. However, given that only his closest associates were privy to the knowledge of her existence as his partner, it can be deduced that no one would have a motive to inflict harm or abduct her. Nevertheless, it is important to note that his negligence will no longer be a factor. Henceforth, he would undertake the requisite actions, as he had been remiss in doing since the outset. All of you, please close your eyes at this time. Theron issued the command, employing his dominant vocal register. The subjects found themselves in a situation where they were compelled to pay heed to the voice, despite their trepidation regarding their personal safety. The individual who intentionally divulged the location during the incident in the forest, which resulted in the students being attacked, is hereby identified and called to account. Theron vocalized with heightened intensity, employing an alpha voice that was more pronouncedly harsh in nature. Despite exerting maximum effort to maintain her position and prevent muscle contraction, her body exhibited a swift response to the higher-ranked werewolf's directive. Subsequent to the utterance of these words, Martha rose to her feet, her body exhibiting a state of trembling and a pallor that was the most extreme. She had scarcely risen to her feet when she was forcibly grasped by a hand and thrust across the expansive throne room, coming to rest in the hallway, where she sustained fractures to her bones. Filled with trepidation at the prospect of incurring the king's ire, she raised her gaze, only to find that Theron was still seated on his throne. The individual who had replaced her and evidently been the one who had thrown her was her grandfather, who had been her primary caretaker since she was a puppy. Merrick Johnson expressed his gratitude to His Highness. He recognized that the king had instructed all individuals to refrain from opening their eyes to avoid disgracing any of the council members. Theron had endeavored to conceal the actions of his own flesh and blood from the world. The elder, who had expressed profound affection for and meticulously nurtured his granddaughter, exhibited a gesture of disdain. This was accompanied by a single movement, which was followed by a swift disappearance from her field of vision. However, this was merely an illusion, as the elder reappeared in close proximity to her. "Grandfather, I did not." Martha's ability to articulate was impeded by the odor of fear that emanated from her, compounded by her earlier initiative in rising to her feet. This prompted him to conclude that she was on the verge of fabricating a falsehood. He had been aware of Martha's persistent ambition and felt that she merited more than the circumstances she was currently experiencing. This is not to suggest any act of treachery. He proceeded to lower his hand without uttering a word, grasping the back of her neck and forcibly pulling her through the crowd until he arrived at the front of the king's presence. Thereafter, he released her, causing her to collapse onto the ground. All other individuals, with the exception of the council members and Elias, are requested to vacate the premises immediately. Theron then issued the following directive. "Your Highness, I did not." Martha endeavored to articulate her thoughts once more. However, her concerns went unaddressed, and no one offered her any verbal acknowledgement until the doors were closed and the crowd departed. "With whom did you confer regarding matters pertaining to Elara?" Theron inquired, attempting to contain his indignation to procure the necessary information. "In another location, perhaps." Elara experienced a sudden and severe headache upon regaining consciousness. She immediately rose to her feet, realizing that she had been struck from behind, which had caused her to lose consciousness. However, the pain continued unabated, as she found herself unable to regenerate using her lycanthropic abilities. She surveyed her environs, but found herself unable to recognize the room, which appeared dark and disconcerting. The sole piece of furniture present was a canopy bed upon which she was positioned. The only discernible detail she could ascertain was that night had already fallen, as evidenced by the steadily ascending full moon. The subject rose to an upright position, her hand moving slightly laterally to dislodge the loose fragments of silk suspended from the bedposts. Concurrently, her heartbeat accelerated, eliciting a sense of trepidation in response to the unknown. As she drew near to the window, the sole source of illumination, her entire being trembled. In the distance, the only observable phenomenon was a white-gray atmosphere composed of innumerable snow-covered trees that enveloped the ground as far as the eye could discern. The desolate landscape evoked a profound sense of foreboding, further exacerbating her trepidation. This marked the first instance in her life that she was alone, as even Sable was not available to disrupt Nyra's transfer. The initial encounter instilled a sense of solitude and unease, exacerbated by the pervasive silence that enveloped the unlit, ominous chamber. The only sound that permeated the stillness was her own labored respiration. Facing away from the window, Elara experienced a sudden freeze, her terror reaching a crescendo. The question thus arises as to why she assumed she was the only one in the room. Her labored breathing from before ceased abruptly as she felt the icy hand that was now almost gently touching her cheek. The handsome man before her, with his platinum blonde hair and ice-gray eyes, evoked an ominous presence, despite his physical resemblance to Theron and his equally imposing demeanor. "Greetings, Alpha." The vulnerability of the most formidable werewolf. It is evident that, in the course of several centuries, a family of two resided in a diminutive dwelling situated at the periphery of a modest village in proximity to an expansive forest. Their existence was characterized by contentment and fulfillment, unfolding amidst the bucolic surroundings. Despite its diminutive proportions, the dwelling sufficed for the mother and son. The subject's life was characterized by significant challenges and difficulties. The mother was compelled to cultivate a modest plot of land in order to provide sustenance for her offspring. This endeavor was made more arduous by the fact that the land was not particularly conducive to the successful cultivation of vegetables. The vegetables cultivated in her modest garden, with the exception of those intended for her own consumption, were necessary for the exchange of goods such as candles, garments, and other essential items for the two individuals. "Mother, I am going to proceed to collect some wood." The 10-year-old boy subsequently apprised his mother of the situation. To ensure the well-being of his subjects, he undertook the responsibility of providing a warm home and fire for cooking, which was incorporated into his daily chores. The utterance of the phrase "all right, sweetie," was perceived by the subject as a positive affirmation. The boy, having already procured a basket, proceeded towards the door, and the man acknowledged his mother. Upon first entering the forest, one would be immediately struck by its imposing nature. As one traversed the trail, the light gradually diminished due to the dense clustering of trees, which reached a more concentrated density at the trail's center. This phenomenon contributed to an atmosphere of eerie solitude. The sun's dim light failed to reach the ground, while verdant flora flourished on all sides. The forest's ominous atmosphere, accompanied by the nocturnal sounds of owls, foxes, and other small animals, as well as the incessant rustling of leaves in the face of the pervasive wind, would likely dissuade any adult from venturing into the forest alone, let alone a child. Nonetheless, the diminutive child entered the structure with a sense of elation, traversing his customary route with a lack of concern for such concerns, and why should he harbor such concerns? In the forest, the most formidable creature to be feared would be the wolf. However, the subject would never be intimidated by one. "Greetings, Gwen." A voice emanated from behind, causing the boy to abruptly rotate his body, his countenance radiating a luminous smile. "Greetings, Richard." The boy greeted his companion, who was positioned on the trunk of a fallen tree, with a sense of relief and elation at his presence. In fact, he played a pivotal role in fostering the confidence of the younger boy, instilling in him the courage to venture into the forest without hesitation. The older boy, a 15-year-old adolescent, exhibited a cheeky smile as he approached the subject after the latter had jumped down on the ground. "Is this your sister Elena?" Gwen inquired, her tone conveying astonishment. Rick was predominantly accompanied by his older sister. However, upon observing the situation, it became evident that Rick was currently experiencing a state of solitude. Rick, in a state of contemplation, reminisced about the once affectionate young lady who had, regrettably, ceased to allocate any of her time to his company. It has been observed that the female subject has been spending a considerable amount of time in the company of a particular individual, and that these interactions frequently involve physical affection. Recalling such events invariably induced a state of physical discomfort. It is evident that the female subject has now established a relationship with her consort, and as a result, she is in his company for the majority of the time. It is unlikely that you will have the opportunity to see her in the near future. Rick replied, his expression conveying a subtle sense of disdain. At this stage of his development, he was not yet considering the prospect of finding a mate, or at least entertaining the possibility of doing so. "My dear fellow, what is that?" The inquiry was posed to the juvenile, who exhibited a state of curiosity. The rationale behind his decision to discontinue his association with Elena, subsequent to her establishment of a new friendship, is a subject of inquiry. The boy, however, did not comprehend the true significance of the word. A werewolf is composed of two distinct components, the physical and the psychological. The goddess, in an act of profound spiritual significance, separates each wolf's soul into two distinct entities and subsequently places these ethereal beings into the wombs of their human parents. Therefore, werewolves who possess complementary halves and successfully locate each other will engage in mating and romantic behaviors. It is evident that they will assume the role of the most significant partner for a werewolf. It is evident that the significance of this phenomenon extends beyond the scope of familial relationships, particularly in the context of the relationship between the speaker and the individual in question. The adolescent expressed dissatisfaction at the conclusion of the event. The aforementioned young lady was in constant proximity to the subject, yet presently, he scarcely noticed her presence. "That is quite an astonishing revelation. Will I ever have one?" Gwen was asked, and he imagined a beautiful girl made just for him. The objective was to establish a harmonious family environment, despite the limited presence of the maternal figure. This assertion is not supported by the evidence. The subject has been identified as a hybrid. My mother stated that only fully transformed werewolves would possess such a feature. Rick responded with candor. He had established a friendship with the young boy a few years prior, having initially encountered him as he entered the forest. His curiosity about meeting a hybrid prompted periodic conversations with the boy. Consequently, whenever he acquired knowledge from the elders of his pack, he would inquire about the similarities between hybrids and them. The adults' disapproving expressions indicated their societal perspective on hybrids, which was one of disdain and disregard. Consequently, they responded dismissively to his inquiries and firmly advised against any interaction with a hybrid. Nevertheless, he continued to meet with Gwen on occasion, despite his sister's counsel against it. "Will I never have one?" Gwen was taken aback when she was asked. He was aware of his hybrid status, a fact that was confirmed by his father. When Gwen witnessed him metamorphose into a genuine giant wolf, she inquired whether his mother possessed the same potential. He was aware of his status as a hybrid, a fact that his father had previously informed him of. However, he had not given the matter much consideration until now, when a sense of inferiority began to take shape within his heart. No. In fact, a hybrid closely resembles more its other parent than the werewolf parent. Consequently, the subject would predominantly exhibit human characteristics, rather than werewolf attributes. Rick responded, unaware of the profound impact the information would have on the boy. The child was so distraught that he did not enter his house at night, opting instead to remain outside, awaiting the return of his father. Perched on the veranda of his abode, he perpetually sought, through visual observation, his presence. It is worth noting that after a period of several hours had elapsed, a sizable black wolf could be observed in the distance as it exited the forest. Typically, he scarcely encountered the latter, once or twice annually. Consequently, he did not inform his mother of his anticipation for the latter, as the woman would have dissuaded him from doing so, recognizing the potential futility of his efforts. He proceeded with alacrity toward the wolf, who, observing his hastened demeanor, had gradually begun to metamorphose into a human form. "Father!" The boy subsequently made a call, which occurred after the man had already embraced him in a state of euphoria. "What factors led you to conclude that I would be present this evening?" The man, endowed with black hair and blue eyes, inquired of the miniature version of himself. "I did not, but I hoped you would." Richard expressed his belief that he would never form a romantic relationship or transform into a werewolf. The young man expressed his anguish to his father, weeping as he recounted his distress. The family had resided for an extended period at the periphery of the village due to the fact that the boy was not a complete human. This necessitated their avoidance of prying eyes. However, upon ascertaining that the boy was not, in fact, a werewolf, he experienced a sense of disorientation and rejection from both societal and supernatural realms. Upon hearing the man's expression of sorrow, the individual experienced a profound realization that they had committed an error in judgment. Observing his offspring lamenting the absence of a companion that would never materialize provoked a profound sense of desolation within him. The sorrow was not solely attributable to the uncertain future that had been forged by the subject for the juvenile, but also to the subject's own uncertain future. As the younger brother of the heir apparent, he had experienced a sense of alienation and aimlessness. The parent's primary focus had consistently been on his older brother. Consequently, he had persistently defied the societal norms imposed on werewolves, in an attempt to garner their approval and affection. However, this behavior consistently elicited a counterproductive response. Upon reaching the age of 17 and undergoing his first shift, he had at least hoped to find a mate and establish a family with her, thereby gaining a sense of purpose. However, the passage of time had elapsed, and the search proved unsuccessful. The subject's emotional state was marked by anger, particularly in the presence of his brother and his partner. This anger was compounded by feelings of envy towards the attention the latter had received from the group. As a result, the subject's sense of direction was further diminished. Upon encountering a captivating female in the forest, he experienced an amorous connection, despite his awareness of his future mate. Notwithstanding the potential injustice he committed against the future werewolf who would become his mate, the man persisted in meeting the woman and even established a family with her. This fact was not known to the werewolf kingdom. It was only after this event that he encountered his true mate, a young woman who had just begun to menstruate. It was at this moment that he comprehended the reason why they had not crossed paths previously. The young lady, endowed with both physical attractiveness and an amiable disposition, was the pride and joy of her parents, who were members of the Council of the King. From a very early age, her parents had been meticulous in their nurturing and guidance. The diminutive woman was delighted to make his acquaintance, delighted, in fact, to have encountered him so early in the day. This feeling, however, was not the result of any awareness on her part of the actions he had taken. The subject's remorse over his decision not to wait for her, as well as the potential repercussions of his actions, which would involve the destruction of lives, were promptly compartmentalized, thereby avoiding the acknowledgement of the consequences of his actions. Consequently, the subject's sentiments shifted to anger regarding the perceived injustice of her belated arrival, compounded by a reluctance to acknowledge the gravity of his misstep. The man's rejection of his partner transpired precisely at the moment of their encounter. Despite their presence in the presence of the king and queen, the subject's obedience was not absolute. The king, his father, had endeavored to dissuade him from this course of action, as a rejection of one's mate was an unthinkable act within the confines of the royal family. However, he disregarded her pleas, even in the face of her profound dismay at his rejection. The subject's predicament, however, was further compounded by the challenge of disclosing his familial status to the others. The assertion that he engaged in coitus with a human female and produced a hybrid offspring is particularly intriguing. The king, enraged by his son's actions, took unprecedented action, exiling the young man from the kingdom and removing his name from the records of the royal family. Consequently, in the future, the existence of the younger brother of the future king would be unknown. The father of the subject had taken the additional step of forbidding anyone from mentioning his name. The man was discontented with the father, who seemingly did not favor him. However, he did not believe that his exile would be permanent. The father's obligation to accept his family and escort them to the royal palace was contingent upon the presence of royal blood in his offspring. Do not shed tears, Gwen. The child has now reached a new level of maturity. There is no need for concern on your part, my son. Despite your hybrid status, you are still capable of overcoming your human side. As I have previously mentioned, you possess the capacity to overcome any challenges you may face. The man reassured his son, gently rubbing his head. Subsequently, the boy smiled, recognizing that Rick's statements lacked logical coherence. His father had consistently asserted that he would transform into a formidable werewolf. His initial hesitation was merely a reaction to the novel information. As anticipated, the father's expertise was regarded as unrivaled. "Please accept this gift I have brought for you." This specimen, classified as a fairy's flower, exemplifies the remarkable characteristics of its genus. This specimen was obtained from the garden of the subject's grandmother. It is evident that the substance is transparent at present. However, should an individual of royal lineage make contact with it, a transformation to a blue hue will ensue. In this case, the subject is instructed to hold the object in their hand. The man expressed his elation. The transformation of the rose from red to blue was identified as a pivotal moment, as it would serve to invalidate the king's previous assertions and consequently bring an end to his exile. The young man, with a countenance marked by a sense of optimism, made contact with the rose, awaiting its chromatic transformation. However, the enchanted rose persisted in its transparent state, defying the expectation of a change in its hue. The substance in question did not exhibit any coloration, including the blue hue. At the present moment, despite her aversion to the sensation of his hand upon her face, Elara remained stationary. The only individual who had ever caressed her cheeks was her mate. In her current human form, she possessed a limited range of actions, as the man before her exhibited the capacity to end her life at the slightest mistake. Despite her trepidation, she was able to comprehend the significance of his utterances. The question arises as to whether the man could have discerned her identity as his mate through her association with the king. The inquiry arises as to why the individual in question would assert that she represented the sole vulnerability of the strongest werewolf. The subject expressed a lack of understanding regarding the subject matter under discussion. Elara adopted a posture of apparent indifference. The general public was largely unaware of her identity as the queen. Given her persistent denial of the claim, it was difficult for the man to ascertain the truth. She expressed a desire to avoid becoming a bargaining chip in his negotiations. The demon-like man expressed amusement at her unsuccessful effort to conceal the truth. The woman before him appeared to embody the archetype of beauty, exuding an innocent and unspoiled quality despite her formal attire, which consisted of a black uniform. The notion of a companion, akin to the aforementioned woman, would be a delightful prospect for him. "Is that so?" the man inquired with a countenance of contentment. The response was affirmative. Elara responded with a firm conviction, maintaining her position despite the implications. The man articulated in a hushed tone, his sentiments elevated by the woman's unwavering eye contact and her apparent lack of alarm. This observation aligns with the anticipated qualities of a future queen, he thought. He did not attempt to elaborate on his statements, rather, he simply raised his other hand from behind him, as if anticipating this exchange and thereby substantiating his assertions. The transparent rose, which his father had once hoped would turn blue at his touch, exhibited a light blue hue as it touched her cheek gently. The subject's gaze was fixed intently on the rose's newly altered hue, evoking a complex array of emotions, a blend of fascination and fury. Despite the repeated insistence of his erratic father, who placed the rose in his son's hands and repeatedly uttered the word blue as if it were an enchantment, the rose remained unchanged. Upon observing the blue rose, Elara promptly moved to the side. During one of her customary perambulations within the garden, Theron finally divulged to her the true significance of the blue color. The identity of this individual remains unclear. It is imperative to ascertain the provenance of his knowledge of the royal family's clandestine affairs. This information is not publicly known, and is only known by Theron and the council. I am surprised, my queen. It is imperative to note that the secret of the royal family remains secure. It is essential to emphasize that the information regarding the Blue Rose has not been disclosed to any individual. The man articulated his sentiments with a voice that was simultaneously hoarse and tranquil. He experienced a modicum of sadness due to the loss of contact. To maintain the warmth of his hand, he clenched his hand into a fist. His cold hand had never been so delighted by another's warmth as it was at this moment. It is conceivable that in a bygone era, the touch of his benevolent mother may have evoked a similar sensation. However, the passage of time has rendered the recollection of such an occurrence somewhat indistinct. Our royal family? Elara was posed the question at a deliberate pace. The subject reported experiencing a high degree of fear due to her unexpected encounter with the individual in question. This fear was further compounded by the uncertainty surrounding the reasons for her abduction. It was unclear whether the man's intent was to engage in a brief dialogue with her before taking her life, or whether a more elaborate scheme had been devised. The man standing before her was the sole individual capable of providing her with the necessary information regarding her location and the circumstances surrounding her presence there. However, paradoxically, his demeanor and presence appeared as enigmatic and mysterious as night itself. Given my relation to Theron as the older cousin, should I have considered myself a member of the royal family? He expressed satisfaction with her perplexed demeanor, which he perceived as a testament to his superiority. The royal palace is the site of the following events. Despite her attempts to resist, Martha was compelled to comply with the king's directive, responding to each inquiry with a meticulous account. This sequence of events subjected her to an escalating degree of alpha pressure from the individuals present in the throne room, intensifying with each response. Initially, she had sought her grandfather's gaze, but he evaded it, merely exhibiting an enraged countenance. Consequently, she averted her gaze, directing her attention toward the ground. As she delved deeper into her introspection regarding her transgressions, the figure gradually approached her. Confronted with the prospect of compelled speech, Martha reluctantly divulged to her captors the limited information she possessed regarding the individual to whom she had provided information, a revelation that, regrettably, proved to be rather scant. The subject had also relinquished her inclination to resist, acknowledging the futility of such efforts, as her reluctance to respond only exacerbated her discomfort. However, she found herself unable to comprehend the role that Elara played in the situation, or the reason why discussing her with others had provoked such vehement displeasure. The subject was an alpha, as well as a moonlight. The inquiry posed pertained to the rationale behind His Highness's treatment of them, characterized as cruel. The subject further inquired into the motivation behind His Highness's actions, specifically the coercion of families to submit and the subsequent extraction of truth through force, a practice that had not been observed in the past. The inquiry concluded with the speculation that these actions were perpetrated solely for the benefit of the subject. It was her unwavering conviction that she would evade capture due to her lineage as the granddaughter of the king's official. Consequently, she had taken a calculated risk in her pursuit of a more promising future. The subject of this investigation is to ascertain the rationale behind the actions of the individual referred to as His Highness. It is important to note that the aforementioned individual engaged in a brief romantic liaison. This prompts the question of whether this was merely a transient affair or if there is a deeper significance to the actions of the individual in question. A review of the individual's initial statements reveals a clear commitment to his queen, suggesting that this encounter may not be merely a casual affair. It is possible that this specimen could be the long-awaited queen. Could this have been the reason for the change in the man's attitude when she spoke of Elara? It is noteworthy that the gentleman's demeanor underwent a transformation upon the mention of the garden, and he expressly inquired about the color of the rose. It is evident that Council Member Albert has undergone a shift in his position, a transformation that was precipitated by the encounter with the woman who made contact with the rose. Should the aforementioned individual possess knowledge that exceeds what he has disclosed, it can be deduced that the individual in question has indeed disseminated a highly perilous piece of information. This situation is analogous to the dissimulation of informing him that the king was not in the palace that night, which would have resulted in the abduction of students. "What is going to happen to me?" She articulated her query in a deliberate, contemplative manner, as if addressing internal musings rather than sharing them with others. She had engaged in conspiratorial activities directed against the prospective monarch, a figure who might have been selected by the deity. The outcome of this situation will be contingent upon the finding of Elara. In the event that Elara is found to be unharmed, the consequences will be limited to exile. Even a minor injury would result in dire consequences. Theron's countenance remained unchanging as he heard the inquiry. At this juncture, Martha's pallor and trepidation rendered her incapable of verbal response or physical manifestation of any other form of reaction. Her profound astonishment manifested as a complete absence of reaction when the guards escorted her to the dungeon. It is noteworthy that she did not attempt to plead or beg for a more lenient sentence. "I will be the first to speak. Elias, it is imperative that you assemble all available men and proceed." Theron indicated his desire to depart, rising to his feet and gesturing towards the exit. "Wait, wait!" In response, Elias immediately advanced to a position in front of him. Elias was admonished to yield his place, or the threat of physical force would be used to compel him. Theron's actions, in conjunction with the aforementioned statements, indicated an escalation in his level of pressure. The necessity to wait was not a viable option, as it was probable that the child was already experiencing feelings of fear in solitude. "It is imperative that you do not attempt to depart independently. It is evident that this course of action will not result in the desired outcome. It is imperative that we proceed in unison. Theron, it is imperative that you pay heed. The opposition's objective is to ensure her survival, as evidenced by their meticulous extraction process from the Academy. It is imperative to note that failure to do so will result in fatal consequences. The group's composition includes hunters, rogues, and witches, among other characters." Elias promptly asserted, endeavoring to persuade him. In a state of considerable agitation, Theron disregarded the provided justifications and, in an effort to spare his companion from harm, a gesture he had been on the verge of implementing at the Academy, he proceeded with great haste, circumventing him in order to depart. He was unsuccessful in his attempt to bypass his friend when the council members positioned themselves in front of him and immediately genuflected. To have opposed the king on two separate occasions would have constituted treason. Elias then proceeded to articulate his thoughts with greater conviction, momentarily pausing to allow his interlocutor to respond. Indeed, In recent times, this individual exhibited a marked predilection for auditory stimuli that were accompanied by a particular designation, which he referred to as a magic name. Elara, what if you were to perish? Do you think she would be pleased? It is reasonable to hypothesize that she would express gratitude. It is evident that the individual in question has a tendency to attribute blame to herself for a multitude of life circumstances. It is imperative to exercise patience and gather a sufficient number of men within a designated time frame. We will all go together. Elias articulated his concerns, stating that he was apprehensive that Theron might have already departed before he could reach him. In corroboration of Martha's account, the missing cases, and the limited number of leads that had been gathered, it is evident that a concerted effort was made to gather information. Firstly, the man had a considerable number of subordinates, about whom they were not well informed. It is evident that Theron possessed the greatest werewolf strength, however, he exhibited mental weakness. His mind was in a state of disarray due to excessive worry, which raises the question of whether he could potentially sustain an injury, similar to his previous experience. Secondly, it was evident that they were engaged in meticulous preparations for a significant undertaking. This undertaking entailed the analysis of a compound known as wolfsbane, which was twice as potent as its predecessor. Furthermore, their research focused on the whereabouts of a particular group of individuals. It was highly probable that they had been engaged in this research for an extended period, meticulously preparing for the eventuality that had been anticipated. The werewolf kingdom boasted a formidable population of werewolves, yet this unexpected turn of events took them by surprise. The absence of a substantial concentration of these entities in a single locale precluded the feasibility of engaging in armed conflict. At present, Elias's forces comprise approximately 2,000 to 3,000 werewolves. However, the question remains whether this number will suffice. Thirdly, the enigmatic man whom Martha referred to was a formidable individual in his own right. The individual in question did not possess the characteristics of a traditional monarch, yet he demonstrated a preference for being addressed as such. Those in his proximity were compelled to reciprocate this usage. His strength was such that Martha experienced a blanching of her skin at the mere utterance of his name, Gwen. It is evident that, in the course of several centuries, at the age of 20, Gwen had gained a profound understanding of the reality of the situation through direct and challenging experiences. From an early age, he exhibited a strong conviction that he would eventually become a formidable werewolf. This belief was instilled in him by his father, who actively fostered this expectation. However, as time progressed, the harsh reality of the situation became increasingly apparent. Confronted with the challenges of living with his father, who was incapable of providing for himself, the situation became increasingly arduous. In the absence of the royal family's support and in the presence of his own kind, the werewolf's transformation was progressing at an accelerated rate. Moreover, he was no longer receiving the emotional and practical support from his mother that he had previously relied on. The night his father returned and announced that they could not move to the royal palace enraged his mother completely. In his youth, he perceived their uncomplicated existence as contented. The sole predicament he discerned pertained to his anticipation of attaining full werewolf form. Evidently, this lifestyle did not align with his mother's aspirations for her future. In a state of profound indignation, she directed a series of expletives at his father, expressing her discontent with the life she had been promised and the life she believed she was entitled to. The paucity of their means had merely served as a means to persuade his father of their hardships, ultimately prompting him to escort them to the royal palace. However, the exile of her father led to the demise of her aspirations. The mother's departure from the family home occurred in the late hours of the night, marking a significant departure from the familial dynamic. This event signaled the mother's relinquishment of her familial responsibilities, leading to a state of abandonment for the father and his offspring. The sole remnant of her presence was the garments and personal effects she had left behind, as well as Gwen himself, whom she had forsaken. This event had a profound impact on Gwen, leading to a comprehensive life change. His father's inability to care for himself, much less that of a puppy, was evident. This transition precipitated a rapid maturation, necessitating the relinquishment of all the elements that had previously defined his childhood. However, throughout the years, he clung to one conviction, despite its implausibility: the aspiration to transform into a genuine werewolf. It is evident that his father's hope has been lost, even in the midst of his mental decline. Father. Following an excursion to the market in the village, he made a desperate call. The response was affirmative. His father replied in a hoarse voice as he rose from his bed. The former young prince, once characterized by his vitality and exuberance, bore little resemblance to his former self. A mere semblance of his former self persisted, albeit indistinguishable from the king of the werewolves, his elder brother. Despite this resemblance, he appeared considerably older than expected, a circumstance attributable to his werewolf nature. The following assertion was made: "I have discovered a method by which we may return to the royal palace." He expressed elation as he abruptly entered his father's room. "How?" the man inquired, his tone devoid of emotion. He was aware that his son had persistently sought information and devised numerous methods over the years. However, he firmly believed that it was impossible to transform a human into a werewolf, a being incapable of altering the hue of a rose. As the local lore goes, the villagers were engaged in discourse regarding. A group of hunters was overheard conversing. The discourse centered on the actions of certain werewolves who had inflicted bites on their victims, with the objective of inducing a transformation into werewolves. This was a strategic maneuver aimed at persuading humans to cease their predatory activities against them. It would be worthwhile to explore the feasibility of this approach. Had I been aware of the simplicity of this process, our collective suffering would have been mitigated. It is hypothesized that Gwen communicated the simplicity of the solution to the problem. However, her audience was unaware of this fact. No. The father, in a state of heightened emotional arousal, refuted the allegations by rising from his bed and grasping a bottle of whiskey. This substance had become the sole source of hydration for the unshaved, ruffled individual in recent days. For what purpose? We could return. The question is posed: should the subject be prevented from undergoing the lycanthropic transformation? Do you want me to rot away like you? Gwen expressed his resentment in a disparaging manner, exhibiting a clear lack of restraint and demonstrating a profound loss of respect for the father figure. It is not possible to do so. The werewolves who attempted this strategy were imprudent. It is reasonable to hypothesize that the subject of discussion among the hunters was the transformation of a human into a lycan. However, it should be noted that a lycan is an irrational creature, they are not constrained by logic or norms. The sole authority with which they could identify was that of their progenitor, yet even that authority would have been considered by Lecan to be unhinged, thus leading to a state of non-compliance with regard to external directives. These creatures, devoid of human morality, pose a significant challenge to the pursuit of scientific knowledge. The father's disapproval was evident as he raised his voice. For better or worse, he had relinquished his beautiful mate and his royal family for them. Now, even his son dared to address him in such a manner, which would have been unthinkable in the past, as no other werewolf would have dared to even look him in the eyes. It is important to note that it is virtually impossible to transform a human into a Lecan. The probability of fatality is high. It is imperative to recognize that one's identity as a human being is unalterable. The intensity of his father's voice escalated, reaching a crescendo as it transformed into a shout. The young and inexperienced son was unable to discern this, yet the father was cognizant of the situation. The failure of such an experiment would result in fatal consequences. Despite his human status, the blood that coursed through his veins was indeed his. This was his son. In the event that a werewolf were to successfully transform a human into a Lecan, the werewolf in question would face a swift demise. However, I am a hybrid. In light of these considerations, the transition to lycanthropy would be a more straightforward process. Moreover, the preservation of rationality would be a distinct possibility. In the event that this is not the case, I would prefer to perish rather than persist in this state of perpetual daily existence. You are my progenitor, the origin of all that exists. The entirety of this situation is your responsibility. The voice's anger, the words spite, the regret, and the fear of solitude all contributed to the werewolf's internal turmoil. He endeavored to persuade his son of the repercussions of his actions, as he did not wish to become the perpetrator of his own demise. Ultimately, Gwen effectively precluded him from exercising any agency in the matter. The man had failed to consider that he had instilled in his son, over an extended period, the belief that he would transform into a werewolf. Consequently, Gwen found herself unable to entertain the prospect of a different way of life. Upon observing the young Gwen in a state of distress, rendered both incapacitated and unresponsive, and confronted with the disconcerting prospect of losing the sole familial connection he had remaining, his father transgressed a significant taboo established by the goddess. While he harbored uncertainty regarding the efficacy of this approach, as a progenitor, he nevertheless nurtured the aspiration that his offspring would persist in existence, even in the face of his own demise. Subsequently, the father embraced his bitten son, holding him to his chest. Tears began to flow from the father's eyes as he embraced the boy, and a faint smile appeared on the werewolf's face. Following an extended period, Gwen's pallor began to transition to a more radiant hue. Concurrently, the werewolf sensed his vital essence ebbing from his physical being, indicating the efficacy of the metamorphosis. Gwen initiated the process of opening his eyes, and he experienced a heightened perception of sensory input. The change appeared to be a genuine occurrence. The ruse that he had employed on his father had proven effective. He smiled radiantly as he rose to his feet, perceiving the strength and power that were gradually flowing into his veins. "Father! Father!" The subject expressed contentment, evidenced by his verbal expression and physical gesture, which included the shaking of his father's arm. This reaction occurred in response to the observation that the werewolf had maintained its position in close proximity to the subject, yet did not exhibit any discernible response. It is not within the realm of possibility that he would have anticipated the absence of a response from his father upon his attempt to elicit attention. The werewolf's cadaver descended due to Gwen's tactile stimulation, and his corpse gradually transformed into a pulverulent state before being dispersed by the wind. He had achieved success, becoming the world's first rational Lycan and the strongest of all, yet this accomplishment came at the cost of his own father's life. The present time the sun had already dipped below the horizon for several hours, and in its absence, the frigid atmosphere became even more frigid and desolate. The absence of humans, animals, or other living organisms was conspicuous. The only signs of life in the area were the trees, which were weighed down by the accumulation of snow. Their branches appeared to be on the verge of collapse due to the weight of the snow and the force of the winds. However, the accumulation of snow remained stationary, as the wind had also been immobilized. This state of inertness had persisted for a considerable duration. It appeared as though this condition would persist for an extended period. However, in a surprising development, even in the absence of the slightest breeze, a gradual and incremental accumulation of snowflakes commenced, with each flake descending individually from the aforementioned arboreal specimens. The initial snowfall was characterized by a low volume of snowflakes, with a few falling at a time from each tree. However, as time progressed, the number of snowflakes increased, reaching a point where their accumulation became too substantial to be accurately measured. This phenomenon can be likened to the restart of snowfall, as though the process had been interrupted and was now resuming. It is noteworthy that there was a complete absence of even a slight breeze, which would have been sufficient to move the leaves and cause their descent. One could not help but ponder the reasons for the snowfall, but this musing was soon interrupted as the forest, previously devoid of life, came to vibrant life. A substantial congregation of werewolves advanced in unison, their movements synchronized, the ground beneath their paws reverberating with their collective stride. Led by a singular, formidable alpha, these creatures moved as a cohesive entity, their actions harmonized in a display of coordinated movement. The midnight black wolf was not aware of fatigue or discomfort. It continued to howl, guiding them towards the location of its beloved. Subsequent alpha-ranked werewolves endeavored to maintain the same speed as the aforementioned subject. From a distance, one might perceive the army to be moving at a rate that appears to be less than optimal in comparison to their king. However, according to the perspective of normal ranked werewolves, the army's speed and strength are noteworthy. They would be hard-pressed to recall an army that has moved with such expediency and resilience through the forest. The werewolves were incensed. They had been informed of the individuals they were rescuing. In order to apprehend the Luna of all packs, one must demonstrate an immense degree of courage. It is imperative to ensure that none of the pack survives the subsequent events. The pressure emitted by their bodies, their raging howls through the night, as they ran between the trees, even ripping some of them apart in their will to follow the shortest distance possible, were terrifying. However, the most daunting entity of all would still be Dusk. In his current state of dominance, he exhibited the most intense levels of aggression. Elara was meticulously suppressing her aura, a deliberate tactic to prevent any form of connection from being established with him. This effectively prevented him from perceiving Sable, ensuring an absence of any emotional or psychological influence from her. In this particular instance, she exhibited no distinguishable characteristics that would differentiate her from a human being, as she was equally powerless in this state. The severed connection engendered a sense of imminent precipice, as if he were teetering on the brink of an abyss. The location in question is Gwen's residence. Elara attempted to articulate her thoughts, but was interrupted by the realization that the royal family lacked any other descendants. Since early childhood, the children had been instructed in the belief that, for an extended period, the lineage of the king's family had comprised a single male progenitor, who had traditionally bequeathed the throne to another male offspring. It is reasonable to assume that this is a pervasive thought among werewolves, given the potential for unbeknownst factors within the royal family. However, I will conclude my remarks here. I did not extend the invitation for this discussion merely to address my own person. Gwen stated that she would gradually advance toward Elara once more. Elara, who had been lost in thought, felt a sense of discomfort due to his proximity, and she moved back. She experienced a sense of intimidation in response to his gaze, which appeared to be an attempt to assess her countenance and innermost thoughts. "Are you aware of this, my dear Alpha? The monarchy is an hereditary institution, thereby signifying that the king's position is not bestowed upon him by the goddess, but rather, it is exclusively conferred upon the queen. One is prompted to ponder the following question: if I were to become king and you were to become queen, would that be in accordance with her wishes?" The utterance was met with surprise. She expressed profound dismay at the prospect of her own companionship being shared with anyone other than Theron. The provenance of this individual remains uncertain. The rationale behind his presumption to fill Theron's role remains unclear. It is also noteworthy that she would never consent to being with another man, even in circumstances where her refusal might result in her death. It is merely posited that the rigid laws the royal family has imposed for such a protracted period, including the rules mandating exclusive mating among specific werewolves determined at birth as pure blood and the enforcement of rigid standards of purity, represent anachronistic and antiquated thinking. This could provide a more receptive environment for the child, particularly in comparison to the influence of a parent who has been deeply influenced by their own strict upbringing. He had once harbored aspirations of becoming a member of the royal family, however, following the demise of his father, he relinquished this ambition. Consequently, he attributed the entirety of his resentment and animosity, which had been accumulating over the years, to them. The subject has been engaged in aimless peregrination for an extended period, amassing a diverse array of individuals from various geographical locations. He had acquired a novel purpose and a renewed sense of self-worth, despite the societal rejection he had faced throughout his life. In the context of his current world, his existence was regarded as an anomaly. However, he sought to transform this world into one where the anomaly would become the norm, and his own existence would be viewed as the logical outcome. The notion that being with one's significant other is essential for achieving complete emotional fulfillment is not necessarily inaccurate. Theron's status as a king is not solely attributed to his lineage, it is also a result of his demonstrated power. He is the foremost among us in this regard. It is evident that the subject in question possesses a level of strength that surpasses that of his werewolf brethren. It is this remarkable quality that has led to his designation as the unifying force among his pack. Regardless of the objective, it is imperative to cease the action in question. It is evident that achieving your objective is improbable. Elara attempted to maintain composure, though she could not help but exhibit a slight tremor due to the revelation. In the event that he was indeed related to Theron by blood, what factors might have led to the transformation of his disposition, resulting in such a profound darkness? This inquiry prompts further examination into the potential motivations behind his reluctance to establish amicable relations with Theron. At this juncture, it is imperative to acknowledge the inaccuracy of this assertion. Even the most robust individuals are only as resilient as their most vulnerable aspect, and in this case, that vulnerability is you. You have become the king of the werewolves, despite being the weakest of them. He stated that, upon directing his gaze at her with a penetrating intensity, he could discern the rationale behind the werewolf king's infatuation. She possessed a beauty that surpassed any he had previously encountered. However, there appeared to be an underlying complexity in her nature, a quality that exerted a powerful allure, akin to the irresistible attraction of a moth to a flame. In the brief period of time he had spent in her presence, he began to feel that if Elara had requested that he relinquish his current endeavors, his resolve to comply might falter. The question arises as to why only Theron was endowed with a mate. The question arises as to why the deity in question exhibited such a marked preference for werewolves. He had maintained his distance, recognizing Theron's similar status as an anomaly, lacking a mate like himself. However, this was not the case. This only served to exacerbate his animosity towards the individual in question, fostering an unrelenting desire to inflict harm upon him. If you are contemplating my utilization as a trading instrument or an armament against Theron, I am prepared to engage in combat until my demise. It is crucial to recognize that the mate of the king would not permit such actions without repercussions. For reasons that were not fully apparent, she issued a vehement threat, expressing a concern that Theron might relinquish his life without offering any form of resistance, should this individual make a request of him. She could not be the cause of his downfall, and she did not want to be the cause of his death. While I am certain that you would encounter difficulties, these challenges would hold little significance in light of your present state. The precise nature of the issue is not yet apparent, however. It is noteworthy that an individual who has vanquished numerous hunters independently, a person who is regarded as an alpha, should not be exhibiting any indications of an aura. It is evident that an intangible element exists, a force that compels one to transcend their human state during this particular moment. Or perhaps you assumed that I was oblivious to your vulnerability at this moment. Upon listening to his discourse, she experienced a sense of being in a state of impasse. On the one hand, she could not, under any circumstances, release her pressure, as this could result in Nyra's death. On the other hand, she could be used to bring down her loved one. The available options were limited to two, yet the inevitable result of her decision would be the loss of life. My king! Lucian's voice resonated as he made his abrupt entrance through the doorway. It was unnecessary for him to provide any additional information. Gwen's presence alone was sufficient to convey the significance of the situation. The man's actions were motivated by a desire to rescue Elara. The following investigation focuses on a coven of witches. Lila articulated in a hushed tone, delicately positioning the potions she had been holding on the table. She experienced a surge of unease. The subject reported experiencing a sense of unease that had been present throughout the day. As nightfall approached, this sensation intensified, reaching a point where it hindered her ability to focus on her research. "What is it?" Vanessa was asked, and she raised her head, which had been resting on her paws. "The event is scheduled to take place this evening. It has already begun." She expressed her discomfort, stating, "I am horrified by this situation." The underlying cause of her anxiety had been ascertained. "Have you reached a definitive conclusion?" the cat inquired once more, rising to her feet and assuming a countenance reminiscent of Esm's. The witch had not informed her of the impending event, however. Her appearance indicated only one possible explanation. "It is evident that the night of prophecy, the night when everything will begin anew or everything will fall, is imminent," Esm stated, her voice quivering with emotion, that they had not arrived in a timely manner. To what extent would the stone have turned blue by this point in time? Would there be sufficient time? Vanessa articulated her concerns with a sense of urgency. In the absence of her powers, what capabilities would Elara possess? It remains unclear whether even a fraction of the ring has undergone transformation at this point in time. It was hypothesized that additional time would be available to complete the task of extracting Naira before the opportunity to do so would be lost. What factors contributed to this deviation from the expected timeline? The inquiry post sought to ascertain the potential for intervention and assistance in addressing the matter at hand. Esm's demeanor conveyed a sense of resignation as she gestured her head in a negative gesture. It was evident that any actions taken subsequent to the initiation of the inevitable sequence of events would prove futile. The subjects had already completed their assigned tasks. The will of the goddess stipulated that Esm inform Elara's sister of her fate, thereby ensuring that the latter would interfere and prevent Elara from being forced to be with an unsuitable partner. The goddess's intentions also included ensuring that Elara would attend the academy and meet her true love, as well as assisting the wolf that had been unwittingly embroiled in Elara's fate in finding a solution to help Naira. This revelation, imparted by her to Myrna many years prior, signaled the predestined path for Lyra's lunar journey. For a period of 100 years, Elara's birth had been postponed with the objective of rectifying the deteriorating circumstances that were exacerbated with each passing day. Over the course of a century, Elara's wolf had undergone a meticulous preparation process, during which it had been reshaped and strengthened. This extensive preparation period was intended to ready the werewolf for the most formidable queen the werewolves could have. As demonstrated by Sable and Elara, the queen's perfection is predicated on her possession of a quality that could potentially be employed as a weapon against herself. This quality manifests in her consistent prioritization of the well-being of others over her own, and her willingness to make significant sacrifices, even to the point of her own life, for the benefit of her loved ones. However, if a ruler were to be selected by the goddess for this purpose, what implications would this have for the werewolf race, particularly those who would be unable to guarantee her survival? The lightness of the full moon illuminated the frozen earth, where the ever-present white snow glistened and sparkled, rendering the darkness of night indistinguishable from the whiteness of day. The minuscule diamonds of snow appeared to glitter in all directions, akin to diminutive luminaries on a theatrical stage, a stage meticulously readied for the most momentous confrontation in the werewolf's historical trajectory. It was as though the moon goddess herself had deliberately chosen to observe this night and had meticulously prepared the battlefield in advance. However, the moon's light would soon diminish, leaving the battlefield in darkness for the sole spectator of this ghastly spectacle. As the white, silvery snow gradually transformed into a vivid crimson hue. The stage was set for the unfolding of a gruesome drama. The thousands of werewolves had traversed a considerable distance when they encountered a structure that, from a distance, appeared to be a fortress-like castle. However, their focus, which had initially been oriented towards the objective ahead, was redirected towards the obstacles in front. A considerable number of werewolves were instructed to take part in the operation, including members of the council, royal guards, and pedagogues at the academy, as well as the majority of the ranking werewolves who were capable of assembling within a brief time frame. These werewolves emitted howls and growls upon perceiving their adversaries, demonstrating their readiness for combat upon receiving the directive. The adversaries that confronted them were of an unexpected nature, brutal, unintelligent beings that should have never been permitted to exist. These beings, brought to existence by the transgressions of their ancestors, traversed before them. These creatures are the result of the transgression of the third taboo, which pertains to the violation of the sacred duty of respect for life. Lycans were incapable of complete transformation into wolves. At best, their bodies exhibited a superficial resemblance to a failed attempt at creating a wolf, primarily due to their heads, which bore a wolf-like appearance. However, their posture and general appearance remained consistent with human form, extending from the lower neck region to the feet. The distinguishing characteristics that set lycans apart included their body coverage in ruffled fur and an elongated spine that gave rise to a tail. However, it should be noted that the physical characteristics of typical werewolves, when in their wolf form, would not be significantly dissimilar to those of a genuine wolf, excepting their size. The werewolves were horrified by the sight before them. The creation of a lycan was an unprecedented success, and the werewolves were able to terminate the life of the abomination after its discovery. These werewolves constitute a significant aberration in the historical record of werewolves, as they were extinct. However, in this particular location, they have been observed in substantial numbers, numbering in the thousands. This occurrence would typically have taken them by surprise. However, in the presence of the king, lycans were of negligible concern, and their actions held no weight. Provided that he could reach his companion, he possessed the capacity to traverse even fire, not to mention other living beings. A sonorous, authoritative howl emanated from the subject's snout, directed towards the moon, reaching the auditory organs of the werewolves and thereby reinstating the prevailing order. It appeared as though he was informing the goddess of the commencement of their play, their war. This could also be interpreted as an order to attack with all available resources and to advance with determination. All werewolves advanced with a thudding gait, their paws exerting considerable force as they forged ahead, following the members of the council who were rapidly traversing the terrain in the shadow of Theron. This formation, akin to an arrow, propelled them with remarkable velocity, cleaving through the throng of lycans. Upon arriving at the scene, Dusk initiated combat by inflicting the first injury, which resulted in the rapid disintegration of a lycan that failed to either react or initiate an offensive maneuver. It was evident that Theron's physical stature was significantly larger than that of the largest lycan. However, this observation was of minor relevance in the broader context of the situation. He did not prioritize engaging in combat with a high number of opponents. His objective was not to engage in combat with them, but rather to traverse them. In a display of coordinated combat, Dusk and Theron engaged in a strategic interplay of rapid exchanges, a tactic employed to confuse and overwhelm their opponents. The human contingent exhibited a swift and methodical progression, transitioning seamlessly between forms. Theron, in particular, exhibited a discernible transformation, opting for a defensive approach, utilizing claws only when absolutely necessary. This strategic decision was made in response to the escalating threat posed by the lichens, who increasingly converged upon him. In the face of overwhelming adversity, characterized by the proliferation of lichens, Dusk found himself in a state of inescapable entrapment. In response to this dire circumstance, Dusk exhibited a transformation that was comprehensive in nature, thereby enabling him to overcome the numerical superiority of his opponents. However, this strategic maneuver was met with a counteraction from Theron, who reclaimed command and effectively countered Dusk's advance. Dusk possessed formidable strength, while Theron exhibited remarkable agility. This formidable combination proved to be highly effective in decimating numerous lichens, although they did not actively seek to do so, as their battles were primarily confined to confrontations with lichens that directly intersected with their path. In close proximity and ensuring the security of their rear, the council members, who were seasoned strategists and combatants with extensive experience, orchestrated the actions of the others as battles erupted in multiple directions. Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.